The journey begins not with certainty, but with a decision that will echo across 65,000 years. Somewhere in what we now call Southeast Asia, groups of anatomically modern humans are pushing the boundaries of the known world. They have already travelled thousands of miles from Africa, adapting to new environments, developing new technologies, learning to survive in unfamiliar landscapes. Now they face their greatest challenge, crossing open ocean to reach land that lies beyond the horizon. The geography of this world is radically different from today. Sea levels are 70 to 90 metres lower than they will be in the 21st century. Land that will later be submerged connects continents and creates pathways that no longer exist. The Asian mainland extends far beyond its modern coastline. What we call Indonesia is largely one continuous landmass called Sundaland. New Guinea and Australia are joined as a single continent called Sahel, vast and empty of humans. Between Sundaland and Sahel lies the challenge. Even at the lowest sea levels, even with the most favourable land bridges exposed, there remains an unavoidable gap. The Wallace Line marks this permanent boundary, a deep oceanic trench that never fully disappeared even during the Ice Ages. The crossing requires traversing a minimum of 90 kilometres of open ocean. Some routes might require less distance but involve multiple island hops. Others might offer single longer crossings. Every option demands intentional seafaring. This cannot be an accident. The distance is too great, the ocean too dangerous, the achievement too consistent. Archaeological evidence shows that humans reached Australia and moved inland within a few thousand years. This suggests multiple successful crossings, probably by different groups at different times. Accidental drift on logs or rafts might explain one lucky landing, but it cannot explain the colonization of an entire continent. These people built watercraft capable of carrying families, supplies, and enough genetic diversity to establish viable populations. We have no direct evidence of these boats. Wood and plant materials decay completely in tropical climates over such vast time spans. No physical remains of watercraft from this period survive anywhere. But the logic is inescapable. People crossed open ocean 65,000 years ago. They did it deliberately, repeatedly, successfully. They must have built boats sophisticated enough for the journey. The absence of artifacts does not mean absence of technology. It means we must infer capability from achievement. Building an ocean-worthy craft requires extensive knowledge. You need to understand which materials work for construction, how to shape them, how to bind them together securely. You need to make the vessel buoyant, stable, and capable of carrying weight without capsizing. Different materials demand different techniques. Bamboo rafts lashed with vine cordage, bark canoes sealed with resin, log rafts with raised platforms. Each design reflects accumulated knowledge, experimentation, refinement across generations. Navigation presents its own challenges. Travelling 90 kilometres across open ocean without instruments requires reading natural signs with precision. The angle of the sun indicates direction during daylight. Stars provide orientation at night, with certain constellations remaining fixed, while others rotate around them. Cloud formations often gather over distant landmasses, visible from far away. Bird flight patterns indicate the direction of shore, as certain species fly out to sea in the morning and return to land in the evening. Ocean swells maintain consistent directions even when wind changes. Experienced navigators read these patterns instinctively. The decision to undertake such a journey suggests either desperation or ambition. Perhaps population pressure made life on Sundaland increasingly competitive. Perhaps environmental changes reduced available resources. Perhaps some groups simply possessed the wanderlust that has always characterized human expansion. Oral traditions from many cultures preserve stories of legendary voyages, of ancestors who travelled beyond the known world seeking new lands. These stories might echo actual historical events, passed down across hundreds of generations. The first landing probably occurred somewhere along Australia's northern coast. The Kimberley region shows some of the earliest archaeological evidence, though coastal sites from this period are now underwater, drowned by rising sea levels over subsequent millennia. The people who stepped ashore entered a world unlike anything they had previously encountered. The plants were unfamiliar. The animals were bizarre by Asian standards. There were no monkeys, no tigers, no elephants. Instead there were kangaroos, wallabies, wombats, and stranger creatures still. The megafauna of Pleistocene Australia would have seemed like creatures from mythology. Diprotodon, a wombat-like animal the size of a rhinoceros, weighing up to 2 tons. Giant short-faced kangaroos standing over 2 meters tall. Marsupial lions with retractable claws and bolt-cutting teeth. Massive goannas. Monitor lizards stretching 5 meters in length. Flightless birds taller than humans. These animals had no experience with human hunters. They had evolved without primate predators. Their behaviour would have reflected this innocence. The colonisation of Australia happened with remarkable speed. Archaeological sites demonstrate human presence from the northern coast to the southern extremity within perhaps 2,000 years of initial arrival. Lake Mungo in southeastern Australia shows occupation by 42,000 years ago. Ur Devil's Lair in the southwest contains artefacts dated to 48,000 years ago. Majibebe Rock Shelter in the north provides evidence of habitation extending back 65,000 years, making it the oldest confirmed site of human occupation in Australia. These dates come from multiple lines of evidence. Radiocarbon dating measures the decay of carbon-14 in organic materials like charcoal and bone. Optically stimulated luminescence dating determines when sand grains were last exposed to sunlight, useful for dating buried sediments. Uranium-thorium dating measures radioactive decay in minerals. When multiple methods applied to the same site produce consistent results, confidence in the dating increases. The evidence points clearly to human presence in Australia extending back at least 65,000 years. The genetic evidence adds complexity to the story. DNA analysis of modern Aboriginal Australians and ancient remains reveals distinctive patterns. Aboriginal Australians carry genetic markers indicating descent from the initial colonising populations with minimal subsequent migration from outside. They show ancestry from Denisovans, an archaic human population that interbred with modern humans in Asia. This Denisovan ancestry appears at higher levels in Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians than in any other modern populations, suggesting the interbreeding occurred before the crossing to Sahul. Some genetic studies indicate that Aboriginal Australian lineages diverged from other non-African populations approximately 70,000 years ago. This timing aligns with the archaeological evidence of arrival around 65,000 years ago. The genetic distinctiveness suggests relative isolation after initial colonisation. While coastal populations likely maintained some contact with New Guinea and possibly with Southeast Asian islands, the Australian interior remained largely isolated. This isolation allowed the development of unique genetic, linguistic, and cultural characteristics. The debate about origins mentioned in internet comments often misunderstands what genetic evidence actually shows. Aboriginal Australians are not from Africa, in the direct sense that some people imagine. All non-African populations share ancestry with groups that left Africa between 70 and 100,000 years ago. Aboriginal Australians descend from these populations just as all other non-Africans do. The distinctive element is not a separate origin, but rather the early divergence and long isolation that followed initial colonisation of Sahul. Physical characteristics like dark skin and tightly curled hair appear in multiple human populations across different continents. These traits evolved independently in response to similar environmental pressures, particularly intense ultraviolet radiation. Equatorial populations in Africa, South Asia, Melanesia and Australia all developed dark skin as protection against sun exposure. This represents convergent evolution, not necessarily shared recent ancestry. And genetic analysis shows that Aboriginal Australians and Sub-Saharan Africans are not more closely related to each other than either is to other non-African populations. The archaeological record shows that these first Australians brought sophisticated technology with them. Stone tools from the earliest occupation layers demonstrate competent flake tool manufacturing. Edge-ground axes appear in the archaeological record from around 65,000 years ago, among the oldest such tools anywhere in the world. These axes required hours of work to produce, grinding and polishing stone to create sharp, durable cutting edges. Their presence indicates that the first Australians possessed advanced stoneworking knowledge and invested significant effort in tool production. Ochre appears in archaeological sites from the earliest periods of Australian occupation. This iron-rich mineral produces red, yellow and purple pigments when ground into powder. People used ochre for body decoration, rock art, and possibly for treating hides. The collection and processing of ochre demonstrates aesthetic awareness and symbolic behaviour. Some ochre had to be transported over considerable distances from source locations, indicating that people valued it enough to carry it during migrations. Rock art provides another window into early Australian life, though dating art precisely presents significant challenges. Some of the oldest, reliably dated rock art in Australia extends back at least 28,000 years, possibly much earlier. The art depicts animals, human figures, hand stencils, and abstract designs. The continuity of artistic traditions across tens of thousands of years suggests deep cultural stability, combined with gradual evolution of styles and techniques. Different regions developed distinctive artistic conventions, reflecting the cultural diversity that emerged across the continent. Shell middens, the accumulated remains of shellfish meals, appear along Australian coasts from very early periods. These middens demonstrate that coastal peoples exploited marine resources intensively and sustainably for tens of thousands of years. Some middens contain shells of species that no longer exist in local waters, providing evidence of environmental change over time. The depth and extent of some middens indicate that certain coastal locations supported continuous or repeated occupation for thousands of years. By 50,000 years ago, humans had spread throughout the Australian continent and into Tasmania, which was then connected to mainland Australia by a land bridge across what is now Bass Strait. People occupied environments ranging from tropical rainforests to arid deserts to temperate woodlands. This rapid expansion across diverse environments demonstrates remarkable adaptability. Groups developed specialized knowledge suited to their particular regions, while maintaining enough cultural continuity to remain recognizable as related populations. The crossing to Australia represents one of humanity's great achievements. It required planning, technology, courage, and skill. The people who accomplished it were not primitive or simple. They were sophisticated, intelligent, and capable of complex problem-solving. They looked at an ocean and decided to cross it. They built the vessels to make crossing possible. They navigated by reading natural signs. They established themselves in an unfamiliar land and adapted to its conditions with remarkable speed. 65,000 years later, their descendants still inhabit the continent their ancestors reached. The journey that began with a decision to cross open water continues in the lives of Aboriginal Australians today. 15,000 years after the first humans arrived in Australia, their descendants have transformed from newcomers into natives. By 50,000 years ago, people occupy every habitable region of the continent. They have developed intimate knowledge of local environments, learned which plants are edible and which are poisonous, discovered water sources in seemingly barren landscapes, and established territories that their descendants will inhabit for millennia. The population has grown from perhaps a few hundred founding individuals to tens of thousands distributed across the continent. The Australia of 50,000 years ago differs significantly from the continent that exists today. The climate is cooler, and in many regions substantially drier than modern conditions. Rainfall patterns favour different vegetation types. Large areas that will later support dense forest are instead covered with grasslands and open woodlands. The Great Barrier Reef does not yet exist in its modern form. Tasmania remains connected to the mainland, and the coastline extends far beyond its present position due to lower sea levels. The most striking difference is the animals. Australia in this period supports a megafauna assemblage unlike anything that will exist in later times. These are not exotic imports from other continents, but unique Australian creatures that evolved in isolation over millions of years. They represent the culmination of marsupial evolution on a continent without placental mammal competition. Many of these animals dwarf their modern relatives in size and strangeness. Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial ever to exist, wanders across the landscape in small groups. These massive herbivores stand 2 meters tall at the shoulder and weigh up to 2,800 kilograms, roughly the size of a modern hippopotamus. They resemble enormous wombats with elongated snouts and powerful limbs adapted for digging. Fossil evidence suggests they feed on a variety of vegetation including leaves, shrubs, and possibly roots excavated with their strong forelimbs. Their size makes them largely immune to predation as adults, though young animals face more risks. Giant short-faced kangaroos of the genus Procoptodon stand over 2 meters tall and weigh up to 240 kilograms. Unlike modern kangaroos that hop on 2 legs, These giants appear to have walked more often than hopped, their anatomy suggesting a different mode of locomotion. Their faces are distinctively shortened, with forward-facing eyes that provide binocular vision unusual among kangaroos. Long arms equipped with a single large claw on each hand might have been used to pull down branches for feeding. They browse on leaves rather than grazing on grass. Marsupial lions, Thelycoleo carnifex, represent the apex predators of this ecosystem. These carnivorous marsupials weigh up to 160 kilograms and possess adaptations unlike any living animal. Their most distinctive feature is their teeth. Greatly enlarged incisors function like canines for biting, while specialized molars act as shearing blades capable of cutting through bone. Retractable claws on semi-opposable thumbs provide powerful gripping capability. Evidence suggests they may have been ambush hunters, possibly even climbing trees to drop onto prey from above. Megalania prisca, a giant monitor lizard, reaches lengths of 5 to 7 meters and weights estimated at 600 kilograms or more. This makes it the largest terrestrial lizard ever to exist. Like modern monitors, Megalania is probably venomous, with toxins that prevent blood clotting and induce shock in prey. It preys on large animals, including other megafauna. Fossil evidence shows that Megalania inhabited both forested and open environments across much of Australia. Giant wombats, enormous flightless birds, massive pythons, and oversized echidnas fill ecological niches across different Australian environments. Genyornis, a flightless bird standing 2 meters tall and weighing up to 240 kilograms, roams in flocks across grasslands. Various species of giant kangaroos occupy different habitats. Massive pythons exceeding 6 meters in length inhabit forested regions. The diversity of megafauna is extraordinary, with over 80 species of large animals coexisting across the continent. Human hunters develop strategies for taking these giant animals. The techniques vary by prey species, environment, and group traditions, but certain patterns emerge across the continent. Cooperative hunting proves essential for dangerous or very large prey. A single hunter cannot safely kill a Diprotodon or defend against a Marsupial Lion. Groups of hunters working together can surround prey, drive animals toward natural traps, or inflict multiple wounds that cumulatively bring down even massive targets. Fire becomes a critical hunting tool. Hunters use controlled burns to drive animals toward waiting hunters, or to funnel them into confined areas where they can be speared more easily. Fire also serves to maintain open grasslands that favour certain prey species over others. The use of fire for landscape management begins during this period and will continue for tens of thousands of years, fundamentally shaping Australian ecology. And people are not merely adapting to their environment, but actively modifying it to serve their needs. Weapon technology develops in response to hunting requirements. Stone-tipped spears provide the primary hunting weapon, with points designed to penetrate thick hide and deliver deep wounds. Some spear points from this period are quite large, suggesting use against massive prey. Wooden spears hardened by fire serve for close-range thrusting attacks. Throwing sticks, predecessors of the boomerang, allow hunters to strike animals from a distance. Different prey and different hunting situations demand different tools. Evidence for human predation on megafauna comes from multiple sources. Archaeological sites contain bones of extinct megafauna showing cut marks from stone tools and burning consistent with cooking. Some bones have been split to extract marrow. Concentrations of megafauna bones at certain locations suggest kill sites where animals were butchered. The association of stone tools with megafauna remains indicates direct interaction between humans and these giant animals. Then, beginning around 45,000 years ago, the megafauna begin to disappear. The extinction is not instantaneous, but occurs over thousands of years. Different species vanish at different times. The largest animals tend to disappear first, followed by medium-sized megafauna. By 30,000 years ago, most of the megafauna are gone. Small populations of some species may persist longer in refugia, but the age of giants is ending. The cause of this extinction generates intense scientific debate. 3 main hypotheses compete, and the truth likely involves some combination of all 3 factors. Climate change proponents point to the end of the last glacial period and the beginning of warmer, more variable conditions. They argue that changing rainfall patterns and vegetation shifts disrupted megafauna food sources and breeding patterns. Large animals with slow reproduction rates could not adapt quickly enough to rapidly changing conditions. Human hunting advocates argue that the arrival of a new predator species disrupted ecosystems that had existed in balance for millions of years. Megafauna had no evolutionary experience with human hunters, and thus possessed no behavioural defences against this new threat. The overkill hypothesis suggests that even modest hunting pressure on animals with slow reproduction rates could drive populations below sustainable levels. Mathematical models show that relatively low hunting rates sustained over thousands of years could cause extinction. The fire hypothesis suggests that human use of landscape burning altered vegetation patterns, reducing food availability for megafauna browsers and grazers. As people increased the frequency of fires beyond natural patterns, they favoured fire-adapted plants over those preferred by many megafauna species. This gradual transformation of plant communities reduced carrying capacity for large herbivores, leading to population declines that ultimately resulted in extinction. Most scientists now view the extinction as resulting from synergistic effects of all three factors. Climate change created environmental stress. Human hunting removed individuals from already stressed populations. Fire regime changes reduced food availability and habitat quality. None of these factors alone might have caused extinction, but their combined effects proved fatal. The megafauna, which had survived previous climate changes over millions of years, could not survive the combination of climate change, a new predator, and widespread landscape modification occurring simultaneously. The extinction of the megafauna forces profound adaptations in human societies. Groups that had developed strategies for hunting giant animals must now focus on smaller, more elusive prey. Kangaroos, wallabies, emus, and smaller marsupials become primary game animals. This shift requires different hunting techniques. Smaller animals are faster and more alert than megafauna. They cannot be surrounded and overpowered by numbers. Instead, hunters must develop stealth, accuracy, and extensive tracking skills. The importance of plant foods increases substantially after megafauna extinction. While plant gathering always contributed significantly to diet, it now becomes even more critical. Women's gathering activities, which might have been secondary to men's megafauna hunting in terms of prestige if not calories, gain increased recognition and importance. Knowledge of plant locations, processing techniques, and seasonal availability becomes essential survival information. Seeds, roots, fruits, and other plant materials are processed with increasing sophistication. By 30,000 years ago, Australia has transformed into something approaching its modern ecological state, though many differences remain. The megafauna are gone, and people have adapted to their absence. Fire management has become more systematic and widespread. Plant processing techniques have become more refined. Tool technologies have diversified to address changing hunting and gathering needs. The Aboriginal Australians of this period are no longer the recent colonisers their ancestors were 15,000 years earlier. They have become the continent's apex predators and master landscape managers, roles they will maintain until European contact 50,000 years in the future. 20,000 years ago, Earth reaches the peak of the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets kilometres thick cover vast portions of the northern hemisphere. So much water is locked in glacial ice that global sea levels sit approximately 120 metres below modern levels. This dramatically reshapes Australia's geography. The continent extends far beyond its current coastline, incorporating what are now submerged continental shelves. Tasmania connects to the mainland via a broad land bridge across what will later become Bass Strait. Australia and New Guinea form a single landmass called Sahel, separated from Asia by narrow but still significant sea gaps. Australia during this period is colder and substantially drier than today. Rainfall across much of the continent averages perhaps 30 to 50% less than modern levels. The reduced moisture combined with lower atmospheric carbon dioxide levels creates harsh conditions for plant growth. Forests contract to favourable refugia along the coast and in mountain ranges. Grasslands and semi-arid scrublands expand across the interior. Sand dunes march across landscapes that will later support more substantial vegetation. The climate is not uniformly harsh, but conditions challenge human populations across much of the continent. Aboriginal populations adapt to these difficult conditions through remarkable ingenuity and detailed environmental knowledge. Groups concentrate in regions that maintain reliable water sources and adequate food supplies. Coastal areas, despite their different geography from later periods, support substantial populations due to reliable marine resources. River valleys inland provide corridors of relative abundance. Highland areas in the southeast offer refuge from the worst of the aridity. Archaeological evidence suggests population density decreases during this period, but occupation continues across diverse environments. Then, around 18,000 years ago, the climate begins to shift. Global temperatures start rising, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed. The massive ice sheets in the northern hemisphere begin to melt. This melting accelerates over the following millennia, releasing enormous quantities of water into the oceans. Sea levels begin to rise, slowly drowning the exposed continental shelves that had provided extensive additional territory during the glacial maximum. This transformation will fundamentally reshape Australia's geography and force massive adaptations from its human inhabitants. The rising waters advance gradually from a human perspective, but relentlessly over centuries and millennia. Coastal communities find their territories shrinking as the ocean encroaches. Places that had been kilometres inland from the shore become coastal, then are submerged entirely. River valleys that had provided travel routes and settlement locations flood, becoming estuaries and eventually drowned valleys beneath the advancing sea. The transformation is slow enough that each generation sees only modest changes, but accumulated across centuries the alterations are profound. Aboriginal oral traditions preserve memories of this flooding in remarkable detail. Stories from coastal regions around Australia describe a time when the sea was far away, when people could walk to places that are now islands or underwater when rivers ran across what is now ocean floor. These traditions appear in multiple independent cultures from different parts of the continent, suggesting they represent actual historical memories rather than coincidental myths. The flooding they describe matches the geological evidence of post-glacial sea level rise. In the Gulf of Carpentaria region of northern Australia, traditions speak of a time when the Gulf was dry land, when freshwater streams flowed across country that is now shallow sea. Geological evidence confirms that the Gulf of Carpentaria was indeed dry land during the glacial maximum, a vast low-lying plain drained by rivers. As sea levels rose, water gradually filled this depression, creating the shallow gulf that exists today. The Aboriginal memories describe this transformation with specificity that startles researchers. Along the southern coast, stories from multiple Aboriginal groups describe land that extended far to the south of the present coastline, land that was lost to rising waters. They speak of hunting grounds that disappeared beneath the waves, of places where ancestors lived that are now under the sea. The continental shelf south of Australia extends substantial distances from the modern coastline, and this shelf was indeed dry land during the glacial maximum. The traditions preserve accurate geographic memory across perhaps 400 generations. Torres Strait between Australia and New Guinea provides particularly compelling evidence of historical memory preserved in oral tradition. Aboriginal traditions from Cape York describe a time when you could walk to New Guinea, when the strait did not exist as a water barrier. This accords precisely with geological evidence showing that Torres Strait was dry land until approximately 8,000 years ago. Sea level rise first created a narrow water channel, then gradually widened and deepened it to the strait's current configuration. The Aboriginal accounts describe not just the existence of this land bridge, but also its gradual disappearance. The flooding forces substantial population movements and territorial reorganisations. Communities inhabiting the now drowned continental shelves must relocate to higher ground. This creates pressure on groups already occupying inland territories, leading to conflicts, negotiations, and new territorial arrangements. Some groups are absorbed into neighbouring populations. Others establish new territories in previously marginal areas. The archaeological record from this period shows changes in stone tool styles and other cultural markers, suggesting population movements and cultural mixing. Bass Strait provides a particularly dramatic example of separation caused by rising seas. During the glacial maximum, Tasmania is simply the southern extension of the Australian continent, connected by a broad plain that supports forests, grasslands and human populations. As sea levels rise, water first forms lakes and swamps across this plain, then creates a narrow channel and finally widens into the strait we know today. The separation becomes complete around 12,000 years ago, permanently isolating Tasmanian populations from mainland Australia. The Tasmanian separation has profound long-term consequences. The isolated population develops distinctive cultural characteristics over the following 12,000 years. Certain technologies present on the mainland disappear from or never reach Tasmania. Bone tools, which appear in mainland archaeological sites, are absent from Tasmanian sites after isolation. The practice of eating fish, common on the mainland, apparently ceases in Tasmania several thousand years after isolation, for reasons that remain debated. The Tasmanian Aboriginal people diverge culturally and to some degree genetically from mainland populations due to their isolation. Other island populations face similar isolation, and in some cases extinction. Kangaroo Island off the South Australian coast supports Aboriginal populations during the glacial maximum when it connects to the mainland. As seas rise, Kangaroo Island separates from the mainland around 10,000 years ago. The archaeological record shows human occupation on the island until approximately 4,000 years ago, then abruptly ceases. The island population apparently dies out, whether from environmental stress, resource depletion, disease, or some combination of factors. When Europeans arrive, Kangaroo Island has been uninhabited for thousands of years. The flooding also creates new opportunities, even as it eliminates old territories. Rising sea levels create extensive new coastal habitats, including estuaries, mangrove swamps, and intertidal zones rich in shellfish and other marine resources. Coastal populations develop sophisticated exploitation of these resources. Shell middens along many Australian coasts begin accumulating during this period, these showing intensive harvesting of oysters, mussels, and other shellfish. Fish traps built from stone appear in coastal areas, demonstrating engineering approaches to improving fishing efficiency. Climate change brings more than just rising seas. Temperature increases transform vegetation patterns across the continent. Forests expand from their glacial refugia into areas that had been too dry to support trees. Grasslands shift their distributions. Animal populations respond to these vegetation changes, with species ranges expanding, contracting, or shifting geographically. Aboriginal groups must adapt their resource use to match these changing patterns, learning new plant species as they appear in local areas and adjusting hunting strategies as animal distributions change. Rainfall patterns increase substantially as the climate warms, particularly across northern Australia where monsoon systems intensify. Rivers that had been reduced to chains of waterholes during the glacial maximum flow year-round again. Lakes that had dried completely refill. The increased moisture supports higher biological productivity, which in turn can support larger human populations. Archaeological evidence suggests population growth during this period as conditions become generally more favourable than during the harsh glacial maximum. The environmental transformation from glacial maximum to modern climate occurs over roughly 8,000 years from 20,000 to 12,000 years ago. This represents about 300 human generations, more than enough time for populations to adapt through cultural change even without genetic evolution. Yet the speed of change is also rapid enough that people can perceive differences within their lifetimes. An elder might remember coastal locations from childhood that are underwater by the time they reach old age. The combination of perceptible change and very long duration creates the conditions for oral traditions to preserve accurate memories across hundreds of generations. By 12,000 years ago, the transformation is largely complete. Sea levels have risen to near their modern position, though they will continue rising slowly for several more millennia. Tasmania is isolated. The continental shelves are drowned. The climate has warmed to approximately modern temperatures. Vegetation has reorganized into patterns that will persist until European contact. Aboriginal populations have adjusted to all these changes, developing the cultural and technological adaptations that will characterize their societies for the next 12,000 years. The people who emerge from this transformation are masters of diverse environments, carrying knowledge systems refined through tens of thousands of years of experience and flexible enough to adapt to profound environmental change. The Australian desert occupies roughly 70% of the continental interior, making it one of the largest arid zones on Earth. Rainfall in the central deserts averages less than 250 millimetres annually, and in many areas drops below 150 millimetres. Water sources are sparse, scattered, and often unreliable. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius in the shade. Winter nights can drop below freezing. To outsiders, this landscape appears barren and hostile, incapable of supporting human life without modern technology. Yet Aboriginal peoples have inhabited these deserts continuously for tens of thousands of years, developing knowledge systems and technologies that allow not merely survival but sustainable, successful occupation. Desert groups organise their lives around seasonal patterns of resource availability, moving through their territories in annual cycles that maximise access to food and water while minimising energy expenditure. These movements follow routes established over thousands of years, refined through countless iterations, encoded in songs and stories that serve as both navigation guides and historical records. The seasonal round is not random wandering, but carefully planned movement through a known landscape, in time to coincide with the ripening of particular plants, the availability of specific animals, and the reliability of certain water sources. Summer, spanning December through February, presents the harshest conditions. Daytime temperatures make vigorous activity dangerous. The sun beats down with intensity that can cause heat stroke within hours for those unprepared. Water sources that flow or hold water during cooler months dry up, reducing the number of reliable locations. Groups contract their territories during summer, staying close to the few permanent water sources that persist through the dry heat. Rock holes that hold water in shaded crevices become critically important. Soakages where water can be excavated from sandy creek beds provide another reliable source. Finding water in the desert requires detailed knowledge accumulated over generations. Certain rock formations indicate likely locations for rock holes. Particular vegetation patterns suggest underground water, accessible through digging. The behaviour of birds provides clues, as many species must drink daily and thus stay within flight distance of water. Bees flying in straight lines are travelling to water sources. Following their flight path can lead to hidden soakages or rock holes. This knowledge is not instinctive but learned, taught explicitly to children and reinforced through practice until it becomes second nature. During the intense summer heat, activity shifts to early morning and late evening. People rise before dawn when the air is coolest, working during the first hours of daylight. As temperature climbs, they seek shade and rest, conserving energy and water. Shade structures built from branches and grass provide protection from direct sun. Natural shade under rock overhangs or in caves offers relief. Late afternoon brings renewed activity as temperatures begin to drop. Evening and night become productive times for travel, social interaction, and certain food processing activities that benefit from cooler conditions. Plant foods available during summer include various seeds from grasses and shrubs. Women gather these seeds by beating grass heads over containers or carrying the entire grass stalks back to camp. Processing seeds is labour-intensive. The seeds must be winnowed to remove chaff, either by tossing them in the wind or by using flat dishes to separate light chaff from heavier seeds. Then the seeds are ground between stones. The resto, the upper stone worked in circular motions against the lower grinding stone, crushing the seeds into flour. This grinding can take hours for sufficient flour to make a meal. The flour is mixed with water to form dough, then cooked either in hot ashes or on flat-heated stones. The resulting bread is nutritious and filling, providing carbohydrates that complement the protein from hunted animals. Different grass species produce seeds at different times, requiring knowledge of which plants to target in which season. Some seeds require additional processing beyond simple grinding. Certain species contain toxins that must be leached out with water or neutralized through specific preparation methods. Mistakes in identification or processing can cause illness. Small animals provide summer protein. Lizards are abundant in desert environments and can be caught with relative ease by those who know where to look. Different lizard species have different habitat preferences. Some bask on rocks during morning warmth. Others shelter under bark or in hollow logs. Goannas, large monitor lizards that can reach over a metre in length, provide substantial meat. Hunting them requires understanding their behaviour, knowing their burrow locations, and skill in either digging them out or smoking them from their holes. Kangaroos and other larger animals are hunted opportunistically during summer, but the extreme heat makes extended pursuit difficult and dangerous. Hunters who locate kangaroo tracks in the early morning may follow them to shade areas where the animals rest during the day's heat. Approaching a resting kangaroo requires extraordinary skill. The hunter must move silently, using any available cover, advancing only when the animal's attention is directed elsewhere. A successful stalk positions the hunter within spear range, close enough that the thrown weapon can strike vitally before the kangaroo can flee. Autumn, from March through May, brings relief from summer's extremes. Temperatures moderate to more comfortable levels. Occasional rains may fall, temporarily filling rock holes and creating ephemeral water sources that expand territorial range. This is the season when groups begin moving more widely through their territories again, exploiting resources that were inaccessible or too energy expensive to reach during summer's heat. Hunting success typically improves as animals emerge from summer inactivity and their movements become more predictable. Controlled burning becomes a major activity during autumn. Aboriginal peoples across Australia use fire as a landscape management tool, and desert groups employ it with particular sophistication. Small fires set in mosaic patterns create a patchwork of burnt and unburnt areas. Newly burnt patches green up quickly with new growth after the first rains, attracting kangaroos and other herbivores to the tender shoots. The burnt areas also make hunting easier by removing concealing vegetation and making tracks more visible. Unburnt patches provide refuge for animals and maintain seed sources for plants. The fire patterns are strategic, not random. The fires are set at specific locations based on detailed knowledge of how fire will spread, given current vegetation, wind conditions, and landscape features. Natural fire breaks like rocky areas or previously burnt patches help contain fires to intended areas. The goal is creating habitat diversity, not destroying vegetation wholesale. Different patches burnt at different times create a landscape mosaic that supports maximum biodiversity and provides resources across the annual cycle. This practice has shaped Australian ecology for tens of thousands of years. Winter, spanning June through August, brings cooler temperatures and in some years significant rainfall. While desert winters are mild compared to temperate regions, nighttime temperatures can drop below freezing. People require warm clothing and shelter adequate for cold nights. Kangaroo skin cloaks provide excellent insulation, worn with the fur against the skin. Windbreaks constructed from branches and grass shield sleeping areas from cold winds. Fires burn through the night, tended to ensure they never die completely, as starting a new fire requires effort better spent on other tasks. Winter is the primary season for large gatherings, when food and water are relatively abundant and temperatures comfortable. Groups that spend much of the year dispersed in small family bands come together at traditional meeting places. These gatherings serve multiple social functions. Young people meet potential marriage partners from other groups, maintaining genetic diversity and creating social bonds between communities. Trade occurs, with goods moving hundreds of kilometres through networks of exchange relationships. Ochre from particular locations, prized for its colour or spiritual significance, travels far from its source. Stone materials suited for tool making are traded to regions lacking good stone resources. Ceremonies occur during these winter gatherings, some lasting for days or weeks. Initiation ceremonies mark the transition of young people into adult status, conveying sacred knowledge and establishing their place within the social and spiritual system. These ceremonies involve songs, dances, body painting with ochre, and instruction in law, history, and spiritual matters. The knowledge transferred during initiations includes practical information about territorial boundaries, water locations, and resource management, integrated with spiritual understanding of the landscape and the proper relationships between people, ancestors, and the land itself. Kinship systems of extraordinary complexity govern social relationships and marriage rules. Desert Aboriginal groups typically employ section or subsection systems that divide the entire population into categories, determining who can marry whom, how people should interact, and what obligations they have to each other. These systems prevent close inbreeding while maintaining social cohesion. A person encountering a stranger from a distant group can determine their relationship through the kinship system, instantly establishing appropriate behaviour and obligations even towards someone they have never met before. Spring, from September through November, brings renewed plant growth and increased animal activity. This is often the season of greatest abundance in desert regions. Plants flower and set seed. Animals that were relatively inactive during winter's cold become more active and visible. Women's gathering productivity increases substantially as plants produce seeds, fruits, and edible shoots. Honey ants, a particularly prized food source, are excavated from their underground nests. These ants store nectar in their abdomens until they swell to grape size, serving as living storage vessels for the colony. Women dig several feet down to reach the chambers where these honeypot ants cluster, extracting them carefully and eating them as sweet treats. Plant species produce different resources at different times through spring. Early spring brings flowers from certain acacias, their seeds harvested later in the season. Various grasses set seed in sequential waves. Fruits ripen on shrubs and small trees. Detailed knowledge of phenology, the timing of natural events, allows people to move through the landscape harvesting resources as they become available. This knowledge is precise, noting not just which plants produce food, but exactly when each species can be expected to reach optimal harvest condition in particular locations. The seasonal movements through territory are not simple circuits, but complex patterns responding to variable conditions. Rainfall varies substantially year to year in desert regions. A location reliable for water in most years may be dry in drought years. Plant productivity varies with rainfall, temperature, and other factors. Groups must adjust their movements based on current conditions, while maintaining the overall pattern that ensures long-term sustainable use. This requires both adherence to traditional knowledge and flexibility to adapt to yearly variations. Navigation across featureless desert terrain requires cognitive abilities that astound researchers who study them. Aboriginal desert peoples maintain mental maps of territories covering thousands of square kilometres, knowing the locations of water sources, significant landmarks, resource patches, and territorial boundaries with precision. They navigate using the sun's position, star patterns, wind direction, subtle changes in vegetation, sand dune orientation, and countless other environmental cues. They can travel directly to locations dozens of kilometres away without visible landmarks, arriving precisely at intended destinations. Songs serve as navigation tools and territorial maps. Songlines or dreaming tracks cross the desert, linking important locations through verses that describe the landscape, water sources, and events from the creative period when ancestral beings shaped the world. A person who knows the song for a particular route can travel that route successfully by following the landscape features described in the verses. These songs encode geographic information in memorable form, allowing accurate navigation across vast distances and transmission of territorial knowledge across generations. The question of why desert peoples remain mobile rather than settling permanently puzzles some outsiders, but the answer lies in understanding desert ecology. Resources in arid environments are scattered and seasonal. Staying in one location would quickly exhaust local resources. Moving through territory in seasonal patterns allows resources to regenerate between visits, maintaining sustainable harvest levels indefinitely. The mobility is not a failure to achieve sedentary civilization, but a sophisticated adaptation to environmental reality. These peoples are not wandering aimlessly, but executing a complex annual strategy refined through thousands of years of experience. Desert groups maintain this lifestyle successfully because they possess encyclopedic knowledge of their environment. An experienced adult knows hundreds of plant species, their uses, their seasonal patterns, and their processing requirements. They know animal behavior in detail, understanding how different species respond to season, weather, and landscape conditions. They know water sources across vast territories and how to find water in areas without obvious sources. They know fire behavior and how to use it as a management tool. This knowledge represents the accumulated wisdom of thousands of generations, tested constantly against the unforgiving reality of desert survival. The desert peoples demonstrate that human adaptation to extreme environments succeeds not through physical specialization, but through cultural knowledge and social cooperation. They survive in one of Earth's harshest environments, not because they are physically different from other humans, but because they possess knowledge systems of extraordinary sophistication, and because their social structures ensure that knowledge is preserved and transmitted across generations. Their success across tens of thousands of years stands as testimony to the power of human intelligence, cultural learning, and social cooperation to overcome environmental challenges that would be insurmountable to individuals acting alone. The northern coast of Australia presents an environment radically different from the desert interior. Tropical monsoons dominate the climate, dividing the year into distinct wet and dry seasons. Annual rainfall in coastal regions can exceed 1,500 millimetres, concentrated almost entirely in the wet season from November through March. Temperatures remain high year-round, rarely dropping below 20 degrees Celsius even in the coolest months. Mangrove forests fringe the coastline, their tangled roots creating nurseries for fish and shellfish. Estuaries mix fresh water and salt water, creating exceptionally productive ecosystems. The ocean itself provides abundant resources for people with the knowledge and technology to exploit them. Coastal Aboriginal groups develop maritime expertise that rivals any seafaring culture. They construct watercraft suited to local conditions using materials available in their territories. Bark canoes are common along much of the northern coast, made by carefully removing large sheets of bark from specific tree species, shaping the bark while it is still flexible, and sealing the seams with resin collected from certain plants. These canoes are light enough to be carried by one person, but stable and seaworthy enough for fishing in coastal waters, river travel, and journeys to offshore islands. The wet season, from November through March, brings torrential rains and high winds. Monsoonal downpours can drop several hundred millimetres of rain in a single day. Rivers that are placid trickles during the dry season transform into raging torrents, carrying enormous volumes of water. Low-lying areas flood, sometimes remaining underwater for months. Coastal communities adjust their settlement patterns to avoid flood-prone areas, occupying higher ground or moving inland temporarily. Despite the challenges, the wet season provides certain resources in abundance. Shellfish become particularly accessible during the wet season. Heavy rains reduce the salinity of coastal waters, affecting the distribution and behaviour of marine life. Mud crabs thrive in mangrove swamps, growing large on the abundant food resources. Women and children wade through shallow water collecting these crabs, using pointed sticks to probe burrows and experienced hands to grab the crabs without being injured by their powerful claws. A productive day's collecting can yield dozens of crabs, providing substantial protein for extended family groups. Fish traps represent one of the most sophisticated technologies employed by coastal peoples. These structures are built from stone in intertidal zones, carefully positioned to take advantage of tidal movements. At high tide, fish swim over the stone walls into the enclosed area. As the tide recedes, the fish become trapped in shallow pools within the stone structure. People can then simply walk into the trap at low tide and collect the fish with minimal effort. Some of these stone fish traps are massive, covering hundreds of square metres and capable of catching large quantities of fish with each tidal cycle. The engineering knowledge required to build effective fish traps is substantial. Builders must understand tidal patterns, including the variation between spring tides and neap tides. They must position walls to maximise fish entry while preventing escape. The walls must be high enough to contain fish at low tide, but not so high that they prevent fish entry at high tide. The structures must withstand the force of tidal currents and storm waves without collapsing. Archaeological evidence shows that some coastal fish traps have been maintained and used for hundreds or even thousands of years. The dry season, from April through October, brings different conditions and different opportunities. Rainfall drops to near zero for months at a time. Rivers shrink to chains of waterholes or cease flowing entirely on the surface, though water may continue flowing underground. Coastal waters become clearer as river sediment input decreases. Fish species shift their distributions in response to changing water conditions. Turtle breeding season brings these marine reptiles to beaches to lay eggs, providing concentrated food resources for coastal groups who know the timing and locations of nesting beaches. Dugong hunting represents one of the most challenging and prestigious activities undertaken by coastal peoples. These large marine mammals, relatives of manatees, graze on seagrass beds in shallow coastal waters. An adult dugong can weigh 400 kilograms or more, providing enormous quantities of meat and fat. However, they are intelligent, wary, and capable of remaining submerged for several minutes. Hunting them requires specialized techniques, considerable skill, and often substantial courage. Hunters pursue dugong from canoes, working in coordinated groups. One or more canoes approach a feeding dugong as quietly as possible, paddlers using subtle strokes that minimize splashing and noise. When close enough, a hunter throws a harpoon attached to a long line. The harpoon point is designed to penetrate deeply and then toggle sideways, preventing it from pulling free. The wounded dugong dives and flees, pulling the canoe behind it in what can become an extended chase. Eventually the animal tires, allowing hunters to approach close enough to deliver killing blows with clubs or additional spears. Sea turtles provide another important marine resource. Several species nest on northern Australian beaches, with females coming ashore during specific seasons to dig nests in the sand and deposit eggs. People monitor nesting beaches, knowing from long experience when turtles are likely to come ashore. A nesting female turtle, focused on the laborious process of excavating a nest and laying eggs, can be approached and captured. The eggs themselves are also harvested, providing rich nutrition. Turtles caught in the water can be hunted with harpoons similar to those used for dugong, though their smaller size makes them less dangerous to pursue. Plant resources along the coast differ substantially from those available inland. Mangrove environments provide various edible species. The fruits of certain mangrove trees are eaten after processing to remove tannins and other compounds that make them unpalatable or toxic when raw. Pandanus palms produce large fruits that contain edible kernels surrounded by fibrous material. The kernels must be extracted carefully, then can be eaten raw or roasted. Various palm species provide edible palm hearts, accessed by cutting down the tree and removing the growing tip, though this kills the tree and thus is done selectively to avoid depleting local resources. Cycad nuts represent one of the most important but also most challenging plant foods in coastal tropical regions. Various cycad species produce large seeds that contain substantial nutrition in the form of starch and protein. However, cycad seeds also contain potent toxins, including glycosides that can cause severe illness or death if consumed without proper processing. Removing these toxins requires extensive processing that demonstrates sophisticated understanding of plant chemistry. The cycad processing technique varies somewhat between groups, but follows a general pattern involving multiple stages. First, the seeds are collected when ripe, usually during specific months when toxin levels are lowest. The hard outer shell is cracked to access the kernel. The kernels are then sliced thinly to increase surface area. These slices are leached repeatedly in running water, sometimes for several days, to remove water-soluble toxins. After leaching, the slices may be dried, ground into flour, and cooked. The entire process can take a week or more from collection to consumption. The knowledge required to process cycads safely is detailed and must be transmitted accurately across generations. Mistakes can be fatal. Insufficient leaching leaves toxins that cause paralysis and other serious symptoms. Using cycads at the wrong stage of maturity increases toxin levels. Processing knowledge includes not just the mechanical steps, but understanding of how to judge when leaching is complete, how to recognize properly processed kernels, and how to avoid contamination after processing. This knowledge represents hundreds or thousands of years of experimentation, observation, and refinement. Fishing techniques employed by coastal peoples demonstrate considerable sophistication and diversity. Hook and line fishing uses hooks carved from shell, bone, or wood, with lines made from twisted plant fibers or animal sinew. Different hook designs target different fish species. Nets woven from plant fiber cordage are used in various configurations. Casting nets thrown in circular patterns over schools of fish in shallow water. Gill nets set across channels or in tidal currents to catch fish swimming into the mesh. Send nets pulled through shallow water to encircle fish. Spearfishing requires different skills than hook and line or net fishing. Hunters wade through shallow water or dive in deeper areas, spotting fish visually and spearing them with multi-pronged spears designed to increase the chance of striking the target. Some fishing spears have detachable points attached to lines, functioning similarly to harpoons. The spear point penetrates the fish and toggles, allowing the fisher to retrieve the fish on the line even if the main spear shaft is lost. Night fishing with torches attracts certain fish species, allowing them to be speared more easily than during daylight. Smoke preservation allows coastal peoples to store fish for extended periods, despite the hot, humid climate that normally causes rapid spoilage. Fish are gutted and cleaned, then suspended over smoky fires for hours or days. The smoke deposits chemicals that inhibit bacterial growth, while the heat drives out moisture that would otherwise promote decay. Properly smoked fish becomes hard and dry, capable of lasting for weeks or months. This preserved fish can be traded to inland groups, extending the reach of coastal resources far beyond the immediate coastal zone. Trade networks connect coastal peoples with groups living inland, sometimes extending hundreds of kilometers from the coast. Coastal groups trade dried fish, shells prized for ornamental or ceremonial use, and salt derived from evaporating seawater. Inland groups provide ochre from specific deposits valued for its colour or spiritual significance, stone materials suitable for toolmaking, and plant products available in the interior regions but not on the coast. These trade relationships are not simple economic exchanges, but social relationships maintained over generations, embedded in kinship connections and mutual obligations. Shell middens, the accumulated remains of shellfish consumed over long periods, provide archaeological evidence of coastal occupation extending back tens of thousands of years. Some middens reach several metres in depth, more representing countless meals across thousands of years of continuous or repeated occupation. Analysis of shells in different layers reveals changes in species composition over time, reflecting environmental changes, sea level fluctuations, and sometimes shifts in human harvesting patterns. The presence of stone tools, charcoal from fires, and occasionally bone or other organic materials in middens provides additional information about past lifeways. Astronomical knowledge serves coastal peoples as it does groups in other environments, but with applications specific to maritime activities. The timing of tides correlates with moon phases, with spring tides occurring around new and full moons and neap tides during quarter moons. Understanding this relationship allows prediction of optimal times for certain fishing activities or for accessing intertidal resources. Star patterns provide navigation aids for night travel by canoe. Certain stars rising or setting at particular times signals seasonal changes relevant to resource availability or weather patterns. Weather prediction becomes critically important in coastal environments where severe tropical cyclones pose significant dangers. Coastal peoples develop detailed knowledge of weather signs that precede major storms. Particular cloud formations, wind shifts, ocean swell patterns, and animal behaviours can all indicate approaching cyclones. Recognizing these signs allows groups to seek shelter in protected locations, secure canoes and equipment, and avoid being caught on the water when storms strike. The ability to read these environmental cues represents accumulated wisdom passed down across many generations, refined through observation and occasionally tragic experience. Coastal Aboriginal societies demonstrate that human adaptation to tropical maritime environments can achieve remarkable sophistication, using materials and technologies available in pre-industrial contexts. They exploit resources from land and sea with equal facility, maintaining detailed knowledge of both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. Their technologies, from bark canoes to stonefish traps to cicad processing, reflect hundreds or thousands of years of refinement and adaptation. Their success across tens of thousands of years of coastal occupation establishes them as among the world's most accomplished maritime peoples, yes, masters of one of Earth's most productive but also challenging environments. Aboriginal Australia at the time of European contact comprises not isolated bands wandering in disconnection, but an interconnected network of societies spanning an entire continent. Approximately 250 distinct language groups occupy territories from the tropical north to the temperate south, from the arid interior to the coastal fringes. Each group maintains its own territory, language, customs, and specialized knowledge adapted to local conditions. Yet these groups are linked through trade relationships, kinship connections, ceremonial obligations, and shared cultural frameworks that create a continental-scale social network of remarkable complexity. Trade goods move across astonishing distances through chains of exchange relationships. Pearl shells from the coast of northwestern Australia travel over 2,000 kilometres inland, passing through the territories of dozens of different groups before reaching their final destinations in central desert regions. These shells are not merely decorative items, but carry spiritual significance and serve as valuable exchange goods in their own right. Each transaction along the route involves not just the transfer of goods, but the maintenance of social relationships between trading partners who may be connected through kinship, ceremony, or long-standing reciprocal obligations. Ochre, a mineral pigment prized for ceremonial and decorative use, moves through equally extensive trade networks. Particular ochre deposits produce pigments of specific colours or qualities that are valued far beyond the regions where they occur naturally. Wilgimia in Western Australia, one of the world's oldest mining sites with evidence of use extending back at least 27,000 years, produces ochre that was traded across much of the western portion of the continent. The mining itself requires specialised knowledge and considerable labour, with tunnels extending deep into the hillside to access the highest quality material. Stone materials suitable for tool production travel hundreds of kilometres from source locations. Obsidian from volcanic areas in Victoria appears in archaeological sites in Queensland, over 1,500 kilometres from its origin. This volcanic glass, which produces edges sharper than modern surgical scalpels when properly worked, is highly valued for cutting tools. The distance these materials travel indicates not haphazard exchange but deliberate trading networks maintained over long periods. The stone passing through so many hands suggests that the value lies partly in the social relationships involved in trade, not merely in the material properties of the stone itself. Pituri, a plant with narcotic properties, represents another trade good that moves across vast distances. The plant grows in specific regions of Queensland and is processed into a form that can be chewed, producing mild stimulant effects. Pituri travels through trade networks extending over 1,000 kilometres from its source areas. The plant is prepared by drying the leaves, mixing them with ash from specific plants to increase potency, and forming the mixture into balls that can be stored and transported. Its use is primarily ceremonial and social rather than subsistence-related, demonstrating that trade involves luxury goods and socially significant items, not merely practical necessities. Ceremonial objects and specialized items with ritual significance also circulate through exchange networks. Sacred objects associated with particular ceremonies may be passed between groups, sometimes traveling in specific directions as part of ceremonial cycles that link distant communities. Message sticks carved with symbolic marks serve as physical tokens carried between groups, their markings conveying information that the bearer elaborates verbally. These objects function as memory aids and authentication devices, confirming that the bearer has been sent with legitimate messages or requests. The logistics of long-distance trade in a non-literate society without pack animals or wheeled vehicles require social structures that ensure reliability across multiple transactions. Goods moving from the northwestern coast to central Australia might pass through the hands of 20 or more different groups, with each exchange occurring between individuals who have established trading relationships. These partnerships often involve reciprocal obligations that extend beyond single transactions. A person receiving pearl shells might be expected to return the favour with ochre or other goods at a later time, creating ongoing relationships rather than one-time exchanges. Large ceremonial gatherings provide concentrated opportunities for trade, social interaction, and the negotiation of marriages. Groups that spend most of the year dispersed in their own territories come together at traditional meeting places during seasons, when resources allow support of larger populations. These gatherings can involve hundreds of people from multiple language groups, sometimes travelling several hundred kilometres to attend. The gatherings last for days or weeks, during which extensive trading occurs alongside ceremonial activities, marriage arrangements, and the resolution of disputes. Language diversity across Aboriginal Australia is extraordinary, with the 250 or so distinct languages at contact representing genuine linguistic diversity rather than merely dialectal variation. These languages belong to multiple language families with no apparent relationship to each other, suggesting divergence over very long time periods. Many Aboriginal languages possess grammatical complexity that matches or exceeds that of any language in the world. Some employ case systems with 15 or more distinct cases. Others have elaborate kinship terminology systems that require different vocabulary depending on the relationship between speaker and listener. Multilingualism is common and often necessary for effective communication across language boundaries. People living near territorial borders typically speak their own language plus the languages of neighbouring groups. Some individuals speak 4, 5, or even more languages with varying degrees of fluency. This multilingualism facilitates trade, intermarriage, and ceremonial participation across language groups. Children growing up in multilingual environments acquire multiple languages naturally through exposure, though certain languages may be restricted to specific contexts or stages of initiation. Sign languages supplement spoken languages in certain contexts and regions. Extensive sign systems allow communication between people who do not share a common spoken language or in situations where speech is prohibited or impractical. During mourning periods, some groups observe speech restrictions requiring the use of sign language instead of spoken words. Hunting contexts where silence is necessary also employ sign communication. These sign languages are not simplified gesture systems, but complete languages capable of expressing complex ideas. Kinship systems create social connections that cross linguistic and territorial boundaries, providing a framework for interaction even between strangers. Many Aboriginal groups employ section or subsection systems that divide the entire population into categories determining social relationships and marriage possibilities. These systems operate through classificatory kinship, where individuals are placed into kin categories based on systematic rules rather than actual biological relationship. A person meeting a stranger from a distant group can determine the appropriate kinship category through questioning about the stranger's parents and grandparents' categories, instantly establishing how they should interact. The kinship system dictates not just who can marry whom, but also behavioural expectations in various relationships. Certain relatives must be treated with respect and formality. Others can engage in joking relationships involving teasing and informal behaviour. Some relatives have obligations to provide assistance or share food. Mother-in-law avoidance rules in many groups require that a man avoid direct contact with his mother-in-law, necessitating communication through intermediaries and creating specific linguistic patterns when indirect reference is necessary. These rules might seem arbitrary to outsiders, but create predictable social structures that reduce conflict and reinforce group cohesion. Marriage arrangements typically involve negotiation between kin groups rather than individual choice alone, though the degree of individual agency varies between groups and circumstances. Marriages create alliances between families and often between different territorial groups. Women frequently marry into groups different from their birth groups, creating kinship links that span territories and language boundaries. These marriage connections establish ongoing relationships between groups, with reciprocal obligations for mutual support, resource sharing during scarcity, and assistance during conflicts. Songlines or dreaming tracks represent one of the most sophisticated aspects of Aboriginal cultural geography. These are routes across the landscape associated with the creative journeys of ancestral beings during the dream time, the period when the world took its current form. Each songline connects significant sites along a route that may extend hundreds of kilometres, crossing the territories of multiple language groups. The song describing the route encodes geographic information in verses that detail landscape features, water sources, and significant locations along the path. Song lines serve multiple functions simultaneously. They are religious narratives describing ancestral actions. They are navigational tools encoding geographic information. They are legal documents establishing territorial rights and responsibilities. They are cultural inheritance passed down through generations. A person who knows the song for a particular route has not just memorized a story, but has acquired detailed knowledge of the landscape, the location of resources, and the spiritual significance of places along the route. Different sections of a songline may be owned by different groups, with each group responsible for maintaining and performing their section. Ceremonial cycles link distant groups through participation in rituals that require cooperation and coordination across large areas. Some ceremonies can only be performed when representatives from multiple groups are present, necessitating travel and gathering. Initiation ceremonies for young people often involve knowledge from multiple groups, with different groups contributing specific elements to the complete ceremony. These ceremonial obligations create networks of interaction that maintain cultural cohesion despite linguistic diversity and geographic separation. Dispute resolution mechanisms exist to manage conflicts within and between groups. Within groups, elders typically mediate disputes, drawing on their knowledge of law and precedent. Between groups, conflicts might be addressed through formal meetings, where grievances are aired and compensation negotiated. In some cases, ritualized combat allows disputes to be settled through controlled violence that prevents escalation to more destructive conflict. Spear-throwing ceremonies permit an injured party to throw spears at an offender, who must dodge without fighting back, with the ceremony ending the matter once the prescribed number of spears have been thrown. The population of Aboriginal Australia at European contact is estimated between 750,000 and 1.5 million, with the uncertainty reflecting the difficulty of estimating populations from historical records that are incomplete and often biased. This population is distributed unevenly across the continent, with higher densities in coastal regions and river valleys where resources are more abundant and reliable. The interior deserts support lower population densities, though even these harsh environments maintain sustainable human populations through the sophisticated environmental knowledge and social adaptations developed over tens of thousands of years. The network structure of Aboriginal Australian society demonstrates that social complexity and continental-scale organisation can exist without centralised political authority, written communication, or urban centres. The system operates through distributed networks of kinship, ceremony and trade that link hundreds of distinct groups into a functioning whole. This organisation allows for both local autonomy and continental connection, with each group maintaining its own language and customs while participating in broader networks that span the continent. The sophistication of this system, it's developed and maintained without writing or formal institutions, represents a remarkable achievement of human social organisation based entirely on oral tradition, personal relationships, and shared cultural frameworks transmitted across thousands of generations. In 1788, Aboriginal Australia is not a dying civilization awaiting rescue, or an empty wilderness ready for claiming. It is a functioning continental society with 750,000 to 1.5 million people, organised into approximately 250 distinct language groups, each occupying defined territories, each maintaining sophisticated knowledge systems adapted to local environments. Coastal peoples exploit marine resources with technologies refined over tens of thousands of years. Desert groups navigate vast arid territories using cognitive maps and seasonal knowledge that allow sustainable occupation of seemingly inhospitable landscapes. Riverine communities manage fish populations and plant resources through controlled burning and selective harvesting. The first fleet arrives in January 1788, carrying over 1,400 people, including convicts, marines, and administrators, to establish a British penal colony at Sydney Cove. The 11 ships represent the vanguard of a colonisation that will fundamentally transform the continent over the following decades and centuries. Initial contact between the arriving British and local Aboriginal people is cautious on both sides, marked by curiosity, wariness, and mutual incomprehension. The two groups operate from completely different cultural frameworks, with incompatible assumptions about land, property, social organisation, and proper human relationships with the environment. The British arrive with the concept of terra nullius, the legal fiction that Australia is uninhabited land belonging to no one, and therefore available for claiming by the Crown. This concept requires defining the Aboriginal peoples as not truly owning the land because they lack European markers of ownership such as fences, permanent buildings, and agricultural cultivation. The Aboriginal peoples, meanwhile, understand themselves as belonging to specific countries, with territories defined by ancestral law, maintained through ceremonial obligation, and managed through seasonal burning and selective harvesting patterns that the British initially failed to recognise as landscape management. Disease arrives with or shortly after the First Fleet, though the exact timing and source remain debated. A smallpox epidemic strikes the Aboriginal population around Sydney in 1789, killing an estimated 50% or more of the local population within months. Smallpox is a European disease to which Aboriginal peoples have no immunity, never having been exposed to it during their tens of thousands of years of isolation from Eurasian populations. The mortality rate is catastrophic. Entire families die, social structures collapse. The survivors are left traumatized, weakened, and unable to maintain their previous ways of life. Whether the 1789 epidemic represents the first introduction of smallpox to Australia, or a later outbreak of a disease introduced earlier, remains uncertain. Some researchers point to evidence of possible earlier epidemics in the 1780s or even 1770s, potentially spread from Indonesian fishermen who visited northern Australian waters, or from other European ships that preceded the First Fleet. Regardless of exact timing, the impact is devastating. Smallpox will sweep through Aboriginal populations across the continent over the following decades, spreading far ahead of European settlement as infected individuals carry the disease to groups who have never seen a European. The epidemic mortality rate varies by region, but consistently reaches levels that destroy social cohesion. When 50 to 90% of a population dies within weeks or months, the survivors cannot maintain previous social structures. Elders who hold crucial knowledge die before passing it on. Ceremonial specialists are lost. Languages spoken by small groups disappear when all speakers perish. The knowledge systems that took thousands of years to develop are fractured, with crucial elements lost forever. Even where people survive, the social disruption is profound enough to prevent full transmission of traditional knowledge to younger generations. Frontier expansion from the initial settlement at Sydney Cove proceeds gradually at first, and then with increasing speed as more settlers arrive and push inland seeking pastoral land. The pattern repeats across different regions as colonisation spreads. Settlers occupy land for grazing sheep and cattle, displacing Aboriginal peoples from territories they have managed for thousands of years. The displacement disrupts seasonal movements, cuts off access to water sources and significant sites, and makes traditional subsistence practices increasingly difficult or impossible. Frontier conflicts erupt as Aboriginal groups resist displacement, and settlers defend their claims to land and livestock. These conflicts take various forms. Aboriginal warriors conduct raids on settler properties, spearing cattle and sheep both for food and to drive settlers away from traditional territories. Settlers organise punitive expeditions in response, sometimes killing Aboriginal people indiscriminately rather than targeting specific individuals responsible for raids. The violence escalates in cycles of revenge and counter-revenge that devastate Aboriginal populations in frontier regions. The technological disparity between the two groups shapes the nature of frontier conflicts. Aboriginal warriors possess sophisticated knowledge of terrain and bush tactics, but fight primarily with spears, clubs and shields. Settlers possess firearms that provide overwhelming advantage in open conflict. Aboriginal tactics therefore emphasise ambush, raids and withdrawal rather than direct confrontation. These tactics can be locally effective, making certain areas dangerous for isolated settlers, but cannot prevent the gradual expansion of settlement backed by superior numbers and technology. Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples face particularly dire circumstances. The island colony establishes itself through violence more extreme than on the mainland. The Black War of the 1820s and 1830s sees systematic efforts to remove Aboriginal peoples from settled districts through a combination of military action and organised drives attempting to push the entire Indigenous population into a defined area. By the 1830s, the Tasmanian Aboriginal population has collapsed from perhaps 5,000 at contact to a few hundred survivors. The last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal person, Truganini, dies in 1876, representing the extinction of a distinct population that had occupied Tasmania for over 35,000 years. The disruption of land-based knowledge systems represents a form of cultural destruction that extends beyond physical violence. So Aboriginal knowledge is fundamentally tied to specific territories. A desert elder's expertise about water sources is useful only in the desert country they know intimately. Coastal fishing knowledge applies to specific reefs and tidal patterns. Plant knowledge relates to local species in their seasonal contexts. When people are displaced from their territories, this knowledge loses its applicability. Even if the knowledge is preserved in memory, it cannot be practiced or transmitted effectively when separated from the landscape it describes. Missions and government reserves established in the 19th and early 20th centuries concentrate Aboriginal peoples from diverse groups into limited areas, ostensibly for their protection and welfare. These institutions impose European cultural norms, attempting to replace Aboriginal languages with English, traditional practices with Christianity, and kinship-based social organisation with nuclear family structures. Children are educated in European ways, explicitly taught that their traditional cultures are inferior and should be abandoned. The stated goal is assimilation, the elimination of Aboriginal cultural distinctiveness through absorption into European society. The stolen generations represent one of the most destructive policies implemented against Aboriginal peoples. From the 1910s through the 1970s, government authorities removed tens of thousands of Aboriginal children from their families, placing them in institutions or fostering them with white families. The official justification involves protection and education, but the underlying goal is assimilation through separation of children from their cultural heritage. Children are forbidden to speak their languages or practice cultural traditions. Many never see their families again. The psychological trauma affects not only those directly removed, but their families and descendants across multiple generations. Population collapse continues through the 19th and early 20th centuries. The census of 1930 records only approximately 50,000 Aboriginal people remaining in Australia. down from the pre-contact population of 750,000 to 1.5 million. This represents a population reduction of roughly 95% over 142 years. The causes are multiple and interconnected: epidemic disease, frontier violence, and a dispossession from land leading to malnutrition, an inability to maintain traditional subsistence, disruption of social structures, forced relocation, and policies explicitly designed to eliminate Aboriginal culture through assimilation. Languages bear devastating losses during this period. Of the approximately 250 languages spoken at contact, many become extinct as their last speakers die without passing the language to younger generations. Others survive, but with severely reduced numbers of speakers, most of them elderly. By the mid-20th century, perhaps 100 languages retain speakers, and many of these are classified as severely endangered. The loss of languages represents not just loss of communication systems, but loss of entire knowledge frameworks, as languages encode specific understandings of landscape, kinship, and proper human relationships with the environment. Despite these catastrophic losses, Aboriginal cultures persist. In remote areas less affected by early settlement, groups maintain traditional practices with greater continuity. Even in regions heavily impacted by colonisation, elements of culture survive through the determination of Aboriginal peoples to maintain their identities despite enormous pressure to assimilate. Ceremonies continue, sometimes in modified forms. Kinship systems persist, organising social relationships even in drastically changed circumstances. Stories are told, connecting younger generations to ancestors and traditional territories even when those territories are no longer accessible. The resilience demonstrated by Aboriginal peoples through this period of catastrophe is remarkable. Facing disease, violence, dispossession, and systematic attempts to eliminate their cultures, Aboriginal peoples adapt, resist, and maintain cultural continuity however possible. The survival of any traditional knowledge through this period represents active effort by individuals who risk punishment to speak their languages, practice ceremonies, and pass knowledge to the next generation. The fact that Aboriginal cultures exist today as living traditions rather than merely historical artefacts is testimony to the determination of people who refuse to let their cultures die. The year 1788 marks the beginning of this rupture, but the rupture is not instantaneous. The destruction unfolds over decades and varies by region and circumstance. Some groups maintain relatively intact cultures into the 20th century. Others are devastated within a generation of first contact. The overall trajectory, however, moves toward cultural disruption, population collapse, and the near elimination of Aboriginal peoples from their own continent. Yet this trajectory does not reach completion. Aboriginal peoples survive, cultures persist, languages endure. The thread running back 65,000 years is damaged, frayed, nearly broken in places, but not severed. What happens next depends on what Aboriginal peoples themselves choose to do with what remains and how the broader Australian society responds to the history of what was done. 65,000 years of continuous cultural presence on a single continent represents a timeline difficult for modern minds to fully grasp. To put this in perspective, the entirety of recorded human history spans approximately 5,000 years from the development of writing in Mesopotamia to the present. Aboriginal Australian culture is 13 times older than recorded history. The pyramids of Egypt, often considered monuments of extreme antiquity, were built approximately 4,500 years ago. Aboriginal peoples had already inhabited Australia for 60,500 years when the pyramids were constructed. Every ancient civilization that modern people think of as old is a recent development compared to Aboriginal Australian continuity. This timeline spans approximately 2,500 generations. If we imagine each generation as a link in a chain, with parents passing knowledge to children who become parents themselves, the chain stretches back 2,500 links from the present to the first arrivals. Each link represents a successful transmission of knowledge sufficient to allow survival and reproduction. The chain never breaks. No generation fails so completely that the knowledge is lost. The continuity represents not just biological descent, but cultural transmission across a time span that exceeds the entire history of agriculture, writing, cities, and every other development we associate with civilization. Aboriginal Australians are not unique in their ancestry extending back tens of thousands of years. All humans alive today can trace their lineage back just as far if we count biological generations. What makes Aboriginal Australian culture distinctive is the cultural continuity in a single place. While populations in other parts of the world were conquered, displaced, absorbed into other cultures, or underwent revolutionary cultural transformations, Aboriginal Australians maintained recognisable cultural continuity in Australia for the entire period. The songs sung today connect to songs sung 40,000 years ago. The territories occupied today are descendants of territories established tens of thousands of years ago. The knowledge accumulated over 65,000 years of continuous occupation of a single continent represents expertise unmatched in depth, if not necessarily in breadth. A culture that has observed the Australian environment for 2,500 generations has had opportunities for learning that cultures existing for shorter periods cannot match. Observations about plant behaviour, animal patterns, weather cycles and ecological relationships accumulate across thousands of years. Experiments with fire management, plant processing, and resource exploitation are tested across enough iterations to refine techniques to extraordinary levels of sophistication. Fire management provides the clearest example of this accumulated expertise put into practice. Aboriginal peoples have used fire as a landscape management tool for at least 50,000 years, possibly since initial colonisation. This is not simple burning but sophisticated application of fire at specific times, in specific patterns, to achieve specific ecological outcomes. The practice creates mosaic landscapes with patches of different vegetation ages, maximising biodiversity and resource availability. Different ecosystems require different fire regimes, knowledge that Aboriginal peoples developed through millennia of observation and experimentation. When Europeans arrived, they misunderstood the Australian landscape as natural wilderness. They saw open forests, grasslands, and productive environments as the baseline condition of the continent. In reality, they were seeing a carefully managed landscape shaped by 65,000 years of Aboriginal fire management. The wilderness was actually more similar to a well-tended garden than to untouched nature. European suppression of Aboriginal burning practices led to dramatic changes in vegetation, with shrubs and dense undergrowth increasing, fire-sensitive species expanding, and overall biodiversity decreasing in many areas. Contemporary fire management in Australia increasingly recognises the value of Aboriginal burning practices. Land management agencies now consult with Aboriginal experts and implement cultural burning practices informed by traditional knowledge. These practices prove particularly relevant given climate change and increasing fire danger. Aboriginal cool burns, conducted during appropriate seasons with careful attention to weather conditions, reduce fuel loads without the catastrophic destruction of hot wildfires. The expertise developed over 65,000 years offers practical solutions to modern environmental challenges. What was lost during the colonial period cannot be fully calculated. Languages that carried specific knowledge frameworks are extinct, their final speakers having died without passing the language forward. Ceremonies that had been performed for thousands of years ceased when the last initiated practitioners passed away. Knowledge of specific plant processing techniques, medicinal applications, and resource locations died with the elders who held it. Each loss represents not just the death of an individual, but the severing of a chain extending back thousands of years. Once broken, these chains cannot be fully restored, yet what survived is equally significant. Approximately 120 Aboriginal languages retain speakers today. Some are spoken by only a handful of elderly people and are critically endangered. Others have hundreds or thousands of speakers across multiple generations and are comparatively stable. Between these extremes lie languages with varying degrees of vitality. The fact that any languages survived the colonial period at all, given the systematic efforts to eliminate them through education policies, mission practices and social pressure, represents extraordinary cultural persistence. Language revitalisation efforts demonstrate Aboriginal determination to maintain and rebuild cultural heritage. Communities with elderly speakers work urgently to record knowledge before it is lost. Younger people learn languages that their parents and grandparents were forbidden or discouraged from speaking. Schools incorporate Aboriginal languages into curricula. Technology aids the process, with digital recordings, online learning platforms, and apps making language learning more accessible. Some languages that had no speakers for decades are being revived through study of historical recordings and documents, bringing them back to use in modified form. Cultural practices maintained through the colonial period or revived afterward demonstrate the resilience of Aboriginal cultures. Ceremonies continue in many communities, yes, some preserved with remarkable continuity from pre-contact times, others adapted to contemporary circumstances while maintaining essential elements. Art continues as a living tradition, with Aboriginal artists working in both traditional media and contemporary forms. The art market for Aboriginal work has grown substantially, providing economic opportunities while maintaining cultural expression. Dot painting, bark painting, and other distinctive Aboriginal art forms are recognised internationally. The land rights movement, beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, represents a turning point in Aboriginal government relations. Aboriginal activists demand recognition of prior ownership and continued connection to traditional territories. Legal challenges culminate in the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976, which allows Aboriginal peoples in the Northern Territory to claim land based on traditional ownership. Subsequent developments extend land rights to other jurisdictions, though the specifics vary considerably between states and territories. The Mairbo decision in 1992 overturns the legal fiction of terra nullius, formally recognising that Aboriginal peoples did own the land prior to European colonisation. Native title, established through the Mairbo decision and subsequent legislation, allows Aboriginal peoples to claim rights to land where they can demonstrate continuous connection based on traditional law and custom. This does not return land to the condition prior to colonisation, as native title exists alongside other interests and can be extinguished by various means. However, it provides legal recognition of Aboriginal connection to country and some degree of control over land use decisions. Successful native title claims have returned millions of hectares to Aboriginal control, though much traditional territory remains inaccessible. The return of Uluru to Aboriginal ownership in 1985 represents both practical land rights and symbolic recognition of Aboriginal connection to country. Uluru, formerly known as Ayers Rock, holds immense spiritual significance to the Anangu people, who are its traditional owners. The return acknowledges this significance and allows Aboriginal management of the site according to traditional law. The subsequent establishment of joint management arrangements between traditional owners and Parks Australia demonstrates evolving approaches to recognising Aboriginal rights while maintaining public access to significant sites. Contemporary Aboriginal populations face substantial challenges, including higher rates of poverty, lower life expectancy, higher rates of incarceration, and poorer health outcomes compared to non-Aboriginal Australians. These disparities reflect ongoing impacts of colonisation, dispossession, and discrimination. Addressing them requires not just individual effort, but structural changes in Australian society, increased resources for Aboriginal communities, and genuine recognition of Aboriginal rights to self-determination. Progress occurs but remains incomplete, with debates continuing about the most effective approaches to improving Aboriginal well-being. Urban Aboriginal communities represent a significant and often overlooked portion of the Aboriginal population. More than half of Aboriginal Australians live in urban areas, maintaining cultural identity and connection to heritage while navigating contemporary urban environments. Urban Aboriginal culture is not less authentic than remote community culture, though it takes different forms. Urban Aboriginal peoples maintain kinship networks, participate in cultural activities, and identify strongly with Aboriginal heritage even when separated from traditional territories by distance or circumstance. The Stolen Generations Inquiry in the 1990s, resulting in the Bringing Them Home report, documents the experiences of Aboriginal peoples forcibly removed from their families as children. The report establishes the extent of the practice, its devastating impacts on individuals and communities, and the ongoing trauma affecting descendants. The National Apology delivered by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in 2008 acknowledges the wrong done and its continuing effects. While an apology cannot undo past harm, it represents official recognition of historical injustice and provides some measure of validation to those who suffered. Aboriginal perspectives on land management, sustainability, and human-environment relationships attract increasing attention in the context of climate change and environmental degradation. A culture that sustained human populations on the Australian continent for 65,000 years without causing environmental collapse clearly developed effective sustainability practices. Fire management has already been discussed, but Aboriginal expertise extends to water management, plant propagation, animal population management, and understanding of long-term ecological cycles. This knowledge, developed through millennia of observation, offers insights relevant to contemporary environmental challenges. The concept of caring for country expresses Aboriginal understanding of the relationship between people and land. Country is not simply territory or resources, but a living entity with which people maintain reciprocal relationships. People care for country through appropriate practices including burning, protecting significant sites, managing resources sustainably, and maintaining ceremonial obligations. In return, country provides for people. This framework differs fundamentally from Western conceptions of nature as separate from humanity, offering an alternative perspective on human-environmental relationships. Academic research increasingly recognises the sophistication of Aboriginal knowledge systems and their value for understanding Australian ecology and history. Archaeological research conducted in collaboration with Aboriginal communities provides insights into deep history while respecting cultural protocols about significant sites and materials. Ecological research incorporates Aboriginal knowledge about fire regimes, plant relationships, and animal behaviour. Linguistic research works to document and preserve endangered languages. This collaborative research benefits from combining Western scientific methods with Aboriginal expertise developed over tens of thousands of years. The question of what 65,000 years of continuous culture means in practical terms extends beyond historical interest. It establishes Aboriginal peoples as the original inhabitants of Australia, with prior and continuing rights to the land. It demonstrates cultural resilience and adaptability across timescales that dwarf other cultural continuities. It provides evidence of sustainable human occupation that modern societies struggling with environmental problems might learn from. It establishes Aboriginal knowledge systems as sophisticated bodies of expertise worthy of serious study and practical application. Looking forward, Aboriginal cultures face both challenges and opportunities. Languages continue to be lost as elder speakers die, but revitalisation efforts show some success. Traditional territories continue to be impacted by mining, development, and climate change, but land rights provide some measure of control over these impacts. Cultural practices continue to evolve, adapting to contemporary circumstances while maintaining connection to deep tradition. The thread that runs back 65,000 years continues into an uncertain future, its strength depending on the choices made by Aboriginal peoples and the broader Australian society. The survival of Aboriginal cultures through the catastrophe of colonisation represents extraordinary resilience. The fact that Aboriginal peoples maintain distinct cultural identities, speak ancestral languages, practice traditional ceremonies, and assert rights to traditional territories demonstrates that the colonial project of elimination and assimilation failed. Aboriginal peoples adapted, resisted, persisted, and maintained cultural continuity despite facing circumstances that destroyed many other Indigenous cultures worldwide. This survival is not passive endurance, but active resistance and cultural maintenance by people who refuse to accept their own disappearance. The story that began 65,000 years ago when people first crossed to Australia continues today. It continues in the Aboriginal communities maintaining traditional practices in remote areas. It continues in urban Aboriginal people navigating contemporary life while maintaining cultural identity. It continues in language programs teaching children words their grandparents were punished for speaking, where it continues in land rights, claims asserting continuing connection to country. It continues in art, ceremony, storytelling, and the countless daily acts through which Aboriginal peoples maintain and transmit their cultures. The thread is damaged but unbroken, worn but holding, connecting the present directly to the deepest past of any human culture on Earth. What the next 65,000 years brings remains unknown, but the thread that survived this long shows no sign of breaking now.